just want to ask, who in the audience thinks that Pierce County ought to be a playful learning landscape community? Okay, we got you, we got you. I think what I'd like to start with is one of the things that Ralph alluded to in his presentation, and Annelise, you kind of dug into it too, is this sense of, or this concept of adaptive systems. So I always like to say, is it a people problem or challenge, or is it a process challenge and problem? And often when we're thinking about process, we're thinking the systems that surround our children and families. So I guess I'd love for each of you to maybe touch on, in the work that you've tried to do, what are some maybe challenges you've encountered or some opportunities you found in helping some of our very old, deeply entrenched systems warm up to some of these different approaches? I don't know.
Yeah.
Annelise, you want to kick it off?
Right, sure. So I think this is a great point to bring up some of the challenges and opportunities, because there are certainly challenges to the work that we've done and what I described. It's not, we don't just go in and do it. It's a process. And so one thing that has helped us implement our work across a lot of Philadelphia, we have these, I think there are now 82 of these installed in Philadelphia, and as you can tell in Santa Ana, we're on our way to getting a lot there. That took years. So the work in Santa Ana, as we described, it's been 4 years in the making, and we really had to go into those spaces and develop really strong connections with the folks who live there. That wasn't just something we came in and said, here we are, we want to do this. We came in, we developed relationships, we established trust. We never started a session with families where we just dove right into what we wanted to do. Like, we would go to those communities. We had all our meetings at their community space in their center that they would go to that was accessible, have dinner. So it was just a space for us to collectively be together and to share space. And I think that these are really important things we can do with communities, because we don't want to just come in and say that we know everything and that we know what they need and then do it. We want to come in, break bread, so to speak, and really develop relationships with those people to understand what their needs and desires are and what we bring to, everybody has an asset to bring to the table, and I think we need to leverage that. One thing that's been really helpful too in Santa Ana is there are obviously lots of things you have to get through city government, right? We don't just go to a park and install these. We develop relationships with government city officials as well, and we actually invited some of those folks to some of our Zoom co-design sessions, and so it gave them an opportunity to see members of their community really invested in the work that we were doing. It showed them firsthand what their ideas were, and it gave us an opportunity to establish connections with those folks as well. So having everybody, I think, at the table when you want to do these, this type of work or bring these initiatives about, I think is really important.
Jennifer, it strikes me, could you address
so I'm happy to chime in. So I'm an outsider. I worked many times in Tacoma, but I live I work and live in Washington, D.C. You are from outside Tacoma and Pierce County. It is really hard to understand how this place is organized. School districts are one entity. The county is another entity. There are cities. Some cities have certain services. Other cities don't have those services. So the place that is Pierce County is a lot of different things and kind of politically or governmentally defined a lot of ways. And so that, and more importantly, as we've been talking a lot about, the geography here is incredibly diverse. The communities across the county are incredibly diverse. Some are densely populated, some are less densely populated. And so what we have struggled with, again, as an outsider looking at Pierce County as a whole, is the needs of one portion of the community can be very different than the needs of another portion of the community. And on average, government systems are not necessarily built to be responsive to that diversity. And so community is a great way to look at the unit of change, but then community does not always line up with the power structures that control the resources.
Matt, you've had some success working with the City of Tacoma in integrating your work with the city planning. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I can talk loudly or I can turn this on. Sure. Great. Yeah, that's, and there may be City of Tacoma people here. Love City of Tacoma people, but it's been difficult. I've been doing this for 10 years. The challenge, so for the work that I do, I'm thinking all the time about the data that we use to drive and influence the decisions we make about investing in communities. City planners, community development specialists, economic development, we're entrenched with a particular type of data. Engagement has to happen. I think if you work in government, if you work for a jurisdiction, then you know you have to talk to the people. There aren't good systems, there aren't good long-standing established ways to talk to a lot of people. Jennifer's talking about how diverse we are as a county, and that's totally true. I mean, Parkland, Midland, Spanaway, Summit, these are very different areas that we think of as the same. There's rural, there's urban, there's socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. So talking to the city, to get back to this, how did I begin working with it? It took a long time. The data that I generate when I work with kids does not look normal. If anybody thinks that the data you see on the screen when I showed you those fuzzy heat maps is normal data that are used in planning and decision-making exercises, they are not. It's still challenging, and I'm still fighting that fight. How do we integrate really emergent forms of big data into decision-making pipelines that have existed for decades and have been driven entirely by secondary quantitative data sets that don't say anything about everyday life? It's a challenge. I think persistence, I think drive, and honestly, you have to have a passion. I think everybody's sitting in this room because you're passionate about something, probably that has to do with youth. And if we're gonna change things, I really think that you have to think differently. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing them since the turn of the 20th century, which we essentially are. So persistence with the city, I will say neighborhood planning, it took a couple of people joining, or the City of Tacoma establishing the Office of Neighborhood Planning within the planning department, and some really creative individuals like at the health department or Metro Parks or Pierce Parks that are interested to engage differently. But you have to find those people.
And Ralph, I want to twist the question just a little bit for you, because Ralph is operating at such high policy development levels, and we appreciate your advocacy and your work there. I'm curious, obviously play is something that Greentrike champions for young people, and despite the tons of research suggesting that play is how our youngest children learn, why can we not adapt our systems of care and education toward that end?
Well, let me see if I can answer that question through your first question, because I like listening to those answers. And let me speak in self-defense. The only thing that Mick Jagger and I have in common is we're probably too damn old. And his knees are a whole lot better than mine. And the other thing I'd say in my defense, you got to remember, I'm a law professor, right? And there's nothing like a simple answer. So let me respond to your question by saying it's all of the above. It's the systems, it's the people, and it's norms. We build government systems because we want accountability for taxpayer dollars. We build them because we want predictability, and that's what bureaucracies do. And so we want them to move quickly. No, that's not what they do. We have community norms. We have norms which we don't articulate. Let me give you an example. You could see it play out. As this notion of going to work every day has changed, and if it changes permanently, Middle-class parents are not going to need the care taken from schools every day. What is that going to do to the notion of the 5-day school week? And how is that going to change how we think about everyday attendance? And what is that going to do when middle-class parents says, I'm going to keep my kid home 2 days a week, but poor children whose families are poor and have to work every day need school every day. That disjuncture is going to be hell on wheels to figure out. So we have these norms, and we don't say systems are normed in middle-class people. We never say that out loud, but it's true. And then poor people are running to adjust and fit into a system that's not theirs to begin with. And in addition to the systems and the norms, we've got the reality that in the not-for-profit sector, we have a lot of social entrepreneurs. And social entrepreneurs, the important word here is entrepreneur. How many entrepreneurs you know have a board? How many entrepreneurs are collaborative? Not many. That's why they're entrepreneurs. So in the social sector, we have a lot of individual people who run an organization who have no clue as to how to collaborate. So if we're going to deal with the trade-offs for entrepreneurship, trade-offs for accountability, and the trade-off for norms, we're going to have a persistent, prolonged insurgency, which is why the Campaign for Grade Level Reading is beginning its second decade and just beginning to see glimmers of hope. And this comes to your last question. If playful learning is going to be a thing, it's going to take a long time to change all of the above. And to change it, understanding that we've gone, you've got to drop evidence base into everything, and we don't have the research tools. And I say this with researchers in the room. We don't have the research tools that can measure contribution instead of attribution. We don't have the research tools that can insist that we get 1 sigma change. Instead, we have grade inflation, and now if we get a 0.5 or 0.6, we say that's a significant effect size. It is not. So how do we get a set of research standards that will tell the truth and say that much of what we're proclaiming works, doesn't work enough to make a sustained change? How do we get an insurgency that can last long enough that it can attack systems, norms, and individual entrepreneurship? And how do we really pay for that over the long term when philanthropy is looking for quick wins? That's the dilemma I think we have, and that's the sense of trade-offs that make this work doubly and triply difficult for all of us.
Well,
See, remember, that's a law professor answer. Not short, but hopefully helpful.
Well, I think in the case of playful learning, you'd be asking a system to readapt their built environments, their approaches, with the students. It's a different kind of learning. And children's museums, obviously are ready to stand at the front of that parade. I'm curious, let's talk about this sense of play and arguing the case, or being able to proof the pudding so that it is a way forward for educating and caring for our youngest citizens. All of you mentioned play in your presentations in a different way. And so I'm just curious what wins you've had or what strategies you've employed to get the adults in the room seeing the power of that approach.
Sure.
Annelise, can I pick on you first?
Of course. A lot of our workshops, we actually start with the question, when you were young, what did you like to play, right? So we try to really bring the adults in the room to a space where, what did you do, how did you play? What was playful for you? And a lot of our co-design sessions too that Julie had mentioned, like the bags of stuff, right? That wasn't just for the kids, it was for the adults, and it's what you are all doing in here right now, drawing and making art. And so I think one of the things we do is we try to show that through play, which we all connect to because it's a very, it's a joyful space for us to be in, but we acknowledge that not everyone has that joyful experience. And so we try to find connections that folks, both kids and adults, can make to joyful experiences that they have, and then how those can be leveraged. In our case, we talk a lot about playful learning. So we think about how we can enrich play with a learning goal or a learning opportunity as well. But I think putting those little prompts in the environment is a really great way. So when we co-design, we have some ways of eliciting play and joy. But then when we're in the communities, when we install these landscapes, we make them we design them so that they elicit joyful, playful experiences as well. And I think we can spark those fun experiences and conversations by simply encouraging those in the ways that we've created different activities. Yeah.
Matt, how about you?
Well, I'm going to come at this differently. I work with, right now I'm working with high schoolers and middle schoolers, and we're talking a lot about their everyday experience. I think about the built environment, right, and how we get kids, or improve that for kids. What is interesting post-pandemic, because I was doing this pre-pandemic for a long time, and post-pandemic, I have never heard so many kids say flat out that I don't go outside. I don't leave the house. I don't go anywhere. I don't spend time anywhere, so what am I supposed to do with my blue pen? Or I don't know what my neighborhood is, because I'm not even sure where I live. And that's new. And I think that there is a shift, and if I'm sure there's teachers in the room, and they've seen the shift too. In their classrooms, kids have become incredibly digital during the pandemic. And I don't know that we're doing a very good job drawing kids outside of the house into those analog experiences at this point. Even if they exist, I think that the draw is so heavy to the digital, to sitting at home on the devices, that it's going to take some effort as a community to not just the work I do. I can identify where kids are, where their opportunities are for us to invest, but what we put there, I think we need to get really creative as a community, and not just throw the same old stuff, because I don't know if it's going to draw kids out. How do we encourage a more analog form of play in our public spaces, or on our streetscapes, or in those active transportation areas? I don't know. I'm not a designer. I have kids. I know how my kids play. My kids are very not digital, and that's been a deliberate kind of weird social experiment that we've done. But they play in a particular way. It's weird, but it's cool. I like it. I dig it. What are those opportunities? There's designers and architects in the room. How do you pull a kid out of the matrix and get them climbing a tree? I'm not sure the answer, but I know where the spaces are. Kids know where they would go. They also know. I was talking to a kid in Parkland last week. He was talking about being young. He's 14, so but being young means pre-pandemic, and how him and his friends used to hang out in the forest next to Sprinker. But since the pandemic, they can't go near the forest next to Sprinker for various reasons that we're all aware of. Those are small. That's low-hanging fruit, right? Clean it up, kids go there. Same deal with McKinley Park. Kids avoid it. There's a slope under the McKinley Overlook. Simple, low-hanging fruit. But for me, I think it's about, I fully believe that we need kids doing analog things, being out in informal. I'm thinking about Jennifer. We were talking about what do kids in Pierce County want to experiment with? Archery and fencing. Totally. If there were an archery range, what's going to get kids out more than weapons? Come out and shoot a bow and arrow, or practice fencing. Maybe we can think differently, or create new forms of spaces for our kids. But that means talking to the kids and encouraging something other than hanging out and whatever it is that they're even doing all day on the computer. I don't know. But, yeah.
Jennifer?
And remember, for me, play has like a very specific definition. Your body's got to be moving, your heart rate's got to get up. And so, not that I don't embrace all forms of play and how it exists, but I'm really focused on that active play. So I face a lot of challenges. One, that is not prioritized because policy hasn't codified it the same way that it has academics and other things. Although we do have requirements around PE and recess, they often are the first ones out the door. You know, 2, the opportunities for play, structured and unstructured, have changed because of the pandemic. There are organizations that don't exist. There are spaces that have become homeless encampments. There are encampments for the unhoused. You know, we don't have the same resources. Yet, I have the benefit right now of an increasing growing understanding from families, from decision makers, from the research that says physical activity is essential to ensure kids' physical, social, and emotional well-being. Like, we know what we have to do. We can figure out what kids want. We just need the capacity to connect those dots and the bravery to protect the space, the time, the resources for those things to happen.
I'm going to be the yes, 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 but person on this panel. And, you know, and let me talk about the economically challenged families, right? Because their voices are not as prevalent in these rooms as they could be. We've just had a pandemic where we spent a year denying there was such a thing as learning lost. In fact, I think we were called it interrupted, unfinished. We had all sorts of euphemism. And we had parents who were at home sometimes with their kids, and they could see the disaster that we were denying. And now we know why we were denying that disaster, because middle-class kids, in terms of academics, didn't suffer that much. The reason the gap narrowed is because the bottom dropped out for the kids who were already at the bottom. That's why the gap broadened, because the bottom dropped out. Middle-class kids who were at home with computers with sufficient bandwidth, they did okay. The parents weren't that good in math, and the kids didn't do that well in math, but otherwise they did okay. It's the poor kids who really lost ground, and we were telling them for a year, oh no, you're fine. Now, for parents who, even before the pandemic, knew and understood the importance of education to the survival of their kid, who saw the prospects of their child being from school to juvenile justice to adult corrections, and who knew that was very real. It's really hard for that parent to wrap their minds around play. They take school and education very serious. And nobody's spending time saying, okay, here's what we mean by play given your reality. We talk about play without considering the fact that those families who are most at risk are our most important audience, because we're speaking to that middle-class norm. And so my corrective here is to say yes, yes, and yes. But for that family who brings a sense of urgency and who sees school as essential to their kids' survival, survival as an adult, survival as a citizen, or survival as a teenager of color, it's really hard for them to prioritize play the way we talk about it. And that's something that we have to wrap our heads around, and that's going to be a major impediment to progress being made with play as a concept. Even though I firmly embrace it, I think if we don't find a way to translate it so it makes sense to people who feel a sense of urgency, that play is not going to be at the top 1, 2, 3, 5, or 10 things on their list. And that's a message that I'm better positioned to bring. And if I leave here without saying that out loud, I would have done a disservice to that community that you've heard me say economically challenged families all day long, so this is no surprise. But I'm also doing a disservice to you, because you're not figuring out that in the question or the answer.
Yeah. Well, before we go to Q&A, I'm hoping, Rolf, can we put up that slide again? I wanted to reference the slide that Ralph shared, and a lot of this does look like the child and youth-centered concepts, different sectors or different containers of folks. And when Ralph showed this to me on our Zoom prep call, I said, you know, in Pierce County, I think we draw dotted lines between the spheres, showing that there is sector collaboration. And you talked a lot about the schools. You know, yes, they are our kids' and I was really, it's a brave thing for you to call school childcare for our families, but I'm glad you called it out, because I think it's really important to acknowledge the role that our schools do play for so many of our families, particularly our lower income. Yes.
It would have been brave before the pandemic, but for all those parents who couldn't go to work because their kids were at home, it's now a reality that's unavoidable.
That needs to be talked about,
Yeah.
right? And so how can other agencies come in and hold hands with our schools and those families? So I guess I'm just curious, before we go to Q&A, could each of you maybe issue a challenge or a wondering or an observation that might help Pierce County build our child and youth-centered framework?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm going to build on what you just said, Ralph, because I think it's important to emphasize, especially all of the places I work are underserved. The kids I'm working with are underserved. Their after-school time is not spent playing. Their after-school time, though, when they get out of school on some days at 12:30 in the afternoon, and they got to find something to do until their parents get home, is spent on streets without sidewalks in neighborhoods they're not comfortable walking through, with no public space to spend time in. So they end up at home. Maybe they're doing homework. I doubt it. You know, they're trying to find something to do after school. And so we've talked a lot, I think, in this community about, we were talking whole child for a long time, and it was whole community. I do think that we still have a problem with those after-school hours between 12:30 or 3:30, whatever it is, and when your parents get home, and that may be late at night. What are you supposed to do as a kid? So play is great, but just livability. We need our kids to be able to safely go someplace and do something, whether that's educational or playful. I don't know that we do enough for those after-school hours or have enough infrastructure, especially in the parts of our cities or our county that needs it the most. So there's a challenge. Get creative.
Yeah. Thank you. Jennifer, Annelise?
I'll build off that and say, I wholeheartedly agree, but let's make sure those places are, and those places, those spaces, those experiences are designed by the young people that they're meant to serve, as opposed to, no offense to all of you, the adults that are in this room. I think assuming that a kid wants to be at any given space that they've had no input in is not going to solve the problem. It's just going to create lots of empty spaces. where kids aren't going.
Essential.
Yeah, and building off of that, I think it's extremely important to listen to youth. It's important to listen to children and adults. So when we think about community in our work, we really value and take a strengths-based approach. And so I think this echoes some of what's been said already today. But I think we need to shift, again, away from thinking of folks who are under-resourced as having deficits or having something that they cannot use, or that they're trying to come up to something that we've already established as they need to get here. I think we need to just meet people where they are and hear them and value their strengths and really use that to leverage how we can design spaces and really create communities for them and with them.
I'm going to yield because I want you to say something about relationships.
Okay. Well, look, I think the core of this work, and we were talking about this morning, is the relationships. It's the relationships between young people themselves, between young people and the adults in their lives, within families, and then broader relationships within communities. What we are talking about this morning is that we surveyed parents of kids that play sports. They ranked their coach as the most trustworthy entity in the lives of their kids, higher than their teacher, higher than any institution. Now, granted, we are talking about this a lot in the context of the pandemic and where you felt like you could get trustworthy information, but coaches came up there. And I think we don't spend enough time talking about the value of relationships from the perspective of adults. I mean, most of us that are up here are educators in some way, shape, or form, and we have basic understanding of child and youth development. Not every person that's in that role does. There definitely was not a guidebook for my husband, a patent litigator, when we had kids, about how to interact with our own children. You know, there's a lot of things that we are making up along the way, but he knows he's got to show up for them. He's got to be home every night for dinner. He's got to be at the sidelines of their games. He's got to go to parent-teacher conferences. We're lucky enough and privileged enough that he can do those things, but, you know, we aren't spending enough time coaching folks on the relationships that they have with young people and prioritizing those over whatever else our priority of the moment is. How'd I do?
Excellent.
Any last word, Ralph?
No, I'm interested in making sure we get the chance to hear.
Yeah. Does anybody have a question for our panel? Yeah.
I guess maybe more of a, less of a question, more of like a, oh, there we go. Hello, hello, there it is. I guess maybe it's more of a question or less of a question and more of a interesting observation, and maybe I'll find a question in here, is that I first off want to say amazing perspectives from all of you, and I'm interested as well to think about, I'm on the side of, like, there are a lot of things that are great about digital interactions and schooling and stuff like we talked about, and there's also a lot of dangers as well. And sometimes I wonder if there's a missing dimension on considering how kids show up in those spaces as well. And I'm not at all an apologist for this at all. I'm just thinking of, if we don't consider the digital as another dimension on the heat map, to draw an example, you know, of another place that they spend time, I wonder if that will become the evil matrix, because we're avoiding it so much instead of trying to go there in interesting ways and be places where they are. And I'll give you an example of this. Early in the pandemic, couple months in, it was really hard for everybody all the way up and down. And our oldest son, he's 14 now, so he would have been 11-ish at this time. Really had a hard time. He was going from 6th grade, from elementary to middle school. Didn't set foot in his middle school, and then had to go totally virtual. It was a mess of an experience, and I'm sure everyone has some version of that kind of story. And for the longest time, he spent a ton of time on his Xbox with his friends, a lot more than what we allowed before then. And initially, I was resistant, like, you can't spend hours on this Xbox, man. Like you can't. I can see it in your face or something, like expecting it to be the big bad boogeyman. And then I heard him laughing, because he was laughing with his friends. And it really changed my perspective on it, as not as the big bad boogeyman, but where else can I make sure that this is, with limits, with adult perspective as well as a father, try to help them show up in those places as well. And so I just share that as perspective. I'm not sure if I have a question there of just adding another dimension to it.
Yeah,
if there's any response, great. If not, it's just
Ralph
an interesting
wants to say
perspective.
something.
I really appreciate that comment. And as we've been following the news lately, we have a 21-year-old who was 18 or 19 at the beginning of the pandemic, who is now accused of compromising national security. And this isn't somebody who was being paid. This isn't somebody ideological we could throw in. all the stuff that he said, racist and homophobic, and we could throw all that in, which means he's like most of the 21-year-olds that we know, and some of them are our kids, you know. And he was simply bragging, building his identity, building a relationship with people on this website, and what he had that would establish him. Now, I'm thinking about him as a 19-year-old. What he had that would establish him was access to this material. And this made him equivalent of the big man on campus. Have we seen those before? In the digital space, because this is where his identity was being formed. This is where he was going to get accolade. This is where he would become the big man on campus in terms of his peer group. And he may spend the rest of his life, or a substantial portion of the rest of his life, in prison because of that. If there's anything else, like right now, I'm afraid to ask my son whether that was one of the websites, he's a gamer, and I'm like afraid to ask him, did you ever see any of this stuff, right? Because what would I do if he said yes? You know, this space is something that holds enormous potential for good and enormous potential for bad. And we are kind of being oblivious. And so I'm really, really glad you asked that question, because this has been haunting me for the last week. And my own son, like, God, am I going to ask him? I hope not. I don't think so, because my son may have told me, but I'm not sure he would have. But we now have a generation of folks who are building relationships, building the sense of themselves in a completely different world apart from the one that we have inhabited and around which we feel that we can navigate. And it scares the living daylights out of me when I think about it too hard.
Yeah, wow. Anybody else want to say anything on that?
It's a great question, right? And I get it, and I have thoughts. So I'm also a professor in my part-time, and do some work on critical theories and digital technologies and the way we experience those digital spaces. I have strong feelings about our kids having the ability to be outside. One of the complications I find with digital spaces, and that's not at all where we're at today, but we kind of ended up here, so I'll just say, from my perspective, one of the issues that I have with digital spaces are they're fully commodified. So our kids in those spaces are dollar signs. How that affects their ability to interact with each other, with the real world, how that affects their perceptions of reality, that's tricky. And we're at a tricky moment, especially coming out of the pandemic. Now, you might say, public outdoor spaces can also be commodified. Sure. If we're doing well as a city, as a region, though, we have many non-commodified outdoor spaces that are not designed to turn our kids into dollar signs, but that are there simply to enable our kids to be kids. So it's a challenge, though, right? How do we, as parents, as mentors of these young people, how do we find that balance? Because we can't all have weird kids that don't know how to use a phone. There is a balance, though, and that's what I'm saying. Finding that way to extract that analog youth from our kids, that's a creative problem. It's not a problem we can't overcome. It just is going to require some creative minds. Rotator, come on, How do we? Where's that analog childhood in a balance with their digital realities? So I bet that Jennifer has a lot to say.
I tend to agree with you, but I think it goes back to relationships, right? Relationships are based on proximity. When you're a 11, 12, 13-year-old boy, I have two of them. The pandemic stank, but they had each other, so there was a little bit of that. But what the digital space does is close that gap between the proximity to create relationships. There's a balance of how do we give that to our kids and how do they then create relationships, hopefully in a good way, with a kid that lives in Cambodia or Japan, or, there are unbelievable things that technology can do. But they have to be paired with the face-to-face interactions between peers and with adults. And we can't lose sight of that.
Yeah, I think in the early learning world in particular, we say it really just takes that one adult. And you're talking about your coaches, you're talking about the different, who are the people in our neighborhood that are going to be that one adult for our children and our youth. And that's really what today was all about, is to figure out how we can knit together as a community, as the businesses that we run, as the nonprofits, the museums. How do we knit together to create that really just tight space so that no child, no youth falls? So can we thank our amazing panel, and I think Megan's going to close out our day.